There is a specific kind of silence that falls inside a person when understanding arrives late and unwelcome. Not the loud silence that follows a slap or a shouted accusation. Not the kind that fills a courtroom or a funeral parlor. I am talking about the quiet kind, the private kind. The silence that settles over a man when he looks down at his dinner plate and realizes, with his fork already in his hand, exactly what has been happening in his own home for the past 11 months. I have been waiting for that silence. My name is Eleanor Hargrove. I am 71 years old. I have a garden I tend before anyone else in the house is awake. I keep a worn leather notebook in the drawer of my bedside table, and I write things down in it. Recipes mostly, but other things too. Things people say, things people do not say, dates. Small moments that most people would forget by morning. I do not forget them. For 2 years, I lived in my son David's house. I cooked every Sunday dinner. I kept the pantry stocked and the floors swept and my opinions to myself. I sat in the corner chair near the kitchen door, the one with the loose back and the draft from the hallway. I wore a sweater my grandson had draped over my shoulders because he was 9 years old and still saw clearly. And every Sunday for the last 11 months of those 2 years, my son walked over to my corner of the table and set a plate in front of me. Not the plate he was eating from, not a plate chosen from the good stack by the window. Mine. The plate prepared in advance, before the Sunday roast was even uncovered, from whatever had been sitting in the refrigerator since Thursday. Every Sunday. I accepted it. I said thank you. I sat in my corner and I ate what I was given. Until the Sunday I did something instead. If you're already feeling something right now, that particular tightening in your chest that comes from recognizing a truth you've seen before, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to Margaret Reed. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. Eleanor always said that the women who stay quiet longest know the most. Let's find out together. The story of how Eleanor Hargrove came to be sitting in a corner chair with yesterday's food does not begin in David's house. It begins 33 years before that Sunday, in a rented commercial kitchen on the east side of Columbus, Ohio. On a morning in October, when a 38-year-old woman with $40 in her checking account and a borrowed stock pot decided that she was going to open a restaurant. This is important. You need to understand who Eleanor was before you can understand what she did. She had grown up in a family where women cooked not because it was expected of them, but because food was the language they spoke most fluently. Her mother had cooked. Her grandmother before her had cooked. Not from recipes, but from memory, from instinct, from the particular intelligence that lives in the hands of people who have fed others for a long time. When Eleanor was 11 years old, her grandmother pressed a piece of paper into her palm one afternoon and said, "That's the bread. Don't lose it." Eleanor had not lost it. She still baked from that recipe every week. Means without measuring the way you breathe. Automatically, completely, without having to think about it. She met Raymond Hargrove when she was 24. He was a contractor's apprentice with a wide, easy smile and the habit of arriving places early, which she found immediately trustworthy. They were married within 18 months. David came 4 years after that, a sturdy, serious child who had Raymond's ears and Eleanor's eyes, and the particular stubborn streak that appeared, apparently, on both sides of the family. The restaurant idea had always been there, humming quietly beneath the surface of the ordinary years. When David was in school and Eleanor was working part-time cashiering at the grocery store, she used to think about it at the register, between customers. The kitchen she would want, the menu she would write, the smell she would build into the walls of the place, so that people would walk in cold and hungry and feel immediately, and without being able to explain it, that someone was glad they had come. Raymond believed in it before she fully believed in it herself. He was the one who found the commercial kitchen for rent. He was the one who helped her draft the business plan on a legal pad at the kitchen table while David slept. He was the one who said, When the bank approved the small business loan, "There it is, Ellie. Now go build the thing." So she did. Hargrove's Kitchen opened on a Tuesday morning in early November, with 6 tables, a menu of 7 items, and Eleanor alone in the back, making everything from scratch. Raymond handled the suppliers. David, who was 9 by then, spent the first Saturday in the back booth doing homework while his mother ran the floor, and he told anyone who came within earshot that his mom's food was the best food in Ohio, a claim that Eleanor found both embarrassing and deeply sustaining. The restaurant grew because the food was extraordinary, and because Eleanor understood something that many restaurant owners never learn. People do not come back to a place for the menu. They come back because the place made them feel something. She remembered regular customers' names and their usual orders, and the small details they had mentioned in passing. This one's daughter was in the school play. That one had recently retired. The couple in the corner booth had been married for 50 years and came in every Wednesday without fail. She made people feel seen, remembered. Worth the trouble of remembering. By the time David was in high school, Eleanor had opened a second location. By the time he graduated from Ohio State with his business degree, a degree Eleanor had paid for in full, quietly, by drawing from the account she had been building since the first profitable year of the restaurant, there were 3 Hargrove's Kitchen locations across Columbus, and a waiting list on weekend evenings at all of them. She never told David the full picture of what the restaurants were worth. Not because she wanted to hide anything, but because she wanted him to feel the pride of what he was doing with his own life. He had worked hard. He had earned his career. She would not diminish that by announcing, "And by the way, your mother is considerably more comfortable than she appears." Raymond died 12 years before the Sunday of the plate. Pancreatic cancer, fast and pitiless, and absolutely without mercy, the way that particular disease tends to be. He was 61 years old. He had been planning to retire the following spring. Eleanor kept the restaurants open because stopping was not something she knew how to do, and because the work kept her present in the world in a way that grief, unoccupied, might not have. She cooked, she managed, she hired good people and trusted them, and visited each location twice a week, and kept the quality exactly where Raymond had always believed it belonged. 18 months after he died, she sold all 3 locations, not because she had to. The restaurants were profitable. She sold them because every table reminded her of him, and she was tired of crying in the walk-in cooler before the morning prep staff arrived. She was tired of the way his name lived in the walls of those kitchens, in the particular creak of the storeroom door at the first location, and in the booth by the window at the second, where they had sat together the night of the opening, holding hands under the table, waiting to see if anyone would come. She let it go. She sold it. She grieved properly, and she healed, and she moved forward in the way that women who have been moving forward their whole lives know how to do. The sale was handled by a lawyer she trusted and conducted with very little fanfare. The 3 locations and the brand sold for $3.4 million. There was a separate real estate arrangement, a parcel she had purchased quietly many years earlier, land she had bought when the neighborhood was worth very little and kept because Raymond had told her, "Land doesn't disappear, Ellie. Hold on to it." That parcel had appreciated considerably. Its value, handled through a small trust she had established a decade prior, was another matter entirely. The parcel in question was the lot David's house stood on. She had paid for it 30 years ago. The house had been built on it 12 years later. The mortgage David believed he was paying against his own purchase was real, but the land beneath the house had never changed hands. It remained, quietly and without anyone having thought to check, in the Eleanor Hargrove Living Trust. This is not a detail that matters yet, but it will. The health scare happened on a Tuesday morning in November. Eleanor had been gardening, pulling up the last of the autumn parsnips in the small plot behind the apartment she had taken after selling the house she and Raymond had shared. She was on her knees in the cool earth, her hands inside the good canvas gloves David had given her for her birthday, when the ground tilted. That was how she described it afterward. Not a pain exactly, more a sudden rearrangement of the world's relationship to vertical. She sat down in the dirt because there was simply nothing else to do, and she sat there for 20 minutes, staring at a parsnip still half in the ground, before her neighbor, Mrs. Pacheco, came around the side fence. The doctors called it a mild cardiac event. Eleanor called it a warning. She was not frightened of it exactly. She had lived a long enough life to understand that the body has opinions and occasionally expresses them dramatically. But she recognized the weight of the word mild and the gap between what it implied and what it might have been. David came to the hospital within 40 minutes. He drove fast and arrived slightly disheveled and held her hand with both of his and said, "Mom! Mom!" as though her name were itself a complete sentence. She found this very comforting. Renata arrived 15 minutes after David. She was composed and helpful, and spoke to the nurses in the efficient tone of a woman accustomed to organizing events. She asked the right questions. She brought Eleanor a glass of water. She stood beside David with her hand on his arm and her face arranged in the expression of a person who is managing a situation. Before the doctor came back with the final discharge assessment, Eleanor watched David and Renata have a conversation in the hallway outside her room. She could not hear it, but she had been reading people for 40 years in restaurant dining rooms, and she could read posture and gesture the way some people read text. David's shoulders kept lifting, the particular lift that meant he was making a case for something. Renata's arms kept folding, the particular fold that meant she was calculating. The conversation lasted about 4 minutes. Then they came back in together, and David held her hand again and said, "Mom, we want you to come stay with us for a while." Renata stood slightly behind him, with her arms at her sides. Eleanor looked at her son's face, the face of the boy who used to do homework in the back booth of her restaurant and tell strangers her food was the best in Ohio. And she said yes. What she did not say was that she had noticed Renata's arms, and that Renata's arms had not unfolded. David and Renata's house was a good house. 2 stories, 4 bedrooms, a kitchen that was larger than Eleanor's first restaurant kitchen and considerably better equipped. It sat in a quiet suburb with streets named after trees and a neighborhood association that sent polite but firm letters about lawn lengths. David had lived there for 8 years. Renata had moved in a year after they started dating and had, in the years since, converted the house in small but thoroughgoing ways into a reflection of herself. She had a gift for design. This was genuinely true, and Eleanor had always acknowledged it. The rooms were beautiful. The colors were sophisticated. The kind of place that made visitors pause in the doorway and say, without quite knowing why, "Oh, this is lovely." What the rooms did not have was warmth. Not the kind Eleanor meant when she used the word. They were immaculate and precisely curated, and they communicated, unmistakably to anyone who paid attention, that this house was under the management of someone who had decided exactly what it would look like and exactly what it would contain. Eleanor moved into the guest room at the front of the house, the one with the window that caught the morning light. She brought her good linens and her leather notebook and her grandmother's bread recipe and the cast-iron skillet she had used since the first day of the restaurant. She made herself useful without making herself conspicuous. She offered to help, but never demanded. She asked before she did things in the kitchen and deferred to Renata's preferences, even when those preferences were, in Eleanor's professional estimation, incorrect. She understood that she was a guest in her son's home. She intended to be a good one. Renata was 43 and managed corporate events for a living. High-end fundraisers, company anniversaries, the kind of occasions where every surface and every detail was calibrated to communicate exactly the right impression. She was sharp and efficient, and she wore her nails in pale neutrals and her hair cut short, and her manner in the particular way of women who have decided that composure is a form of armor and have worn it long enough that it no longer comes off. Their relationship had never been warm, not hostile, never openly hostile, because Renata did not operate openly when a quieter approach was available. but not warm. When David had first introduced them, 11 years earlier, Renata had shaken Eleanor's hand and said, "David's told me so much about you," in the tone of someone completing a form. She had not said what he'd told her. She had not seemed curious to find out anything more. Over the years, Eleanor had tried in the ways that mothers try when they love their sons and want to make peace with the people their sons have chosen. She brought food. She offered help. She asked questions about Renata's work that were genuine questions, because Eleanor had spent 3 decades running a business and understood what that required, and she was genuinely interested. Renata answered with the courteous brevity of a person who has decided, very early and very firmly, that a certain relationship will remain at a precise and managed distance. Eleanor eventually arrived at the word irrelevant and let it stand. Not disliked, not resented. Simply outside the picture, Renata was composing of her own life. The problem, of course, was that irrelevant people do not sit at the head of the table. And a woman who has spent 30 years feeding people and building something from nothing tends eventually to notice. Yet the changes happened slowly. That is important to understand. Not in a rush, not all at once, not in any single gesture dramatic enough to name directly. The changes happened the way slow erosion does, by degrees so small that each one could be explained away, absorbed, set aside in the name of keeping peace. 8 months after Eleanor moved in, Renata's parents came to visit for a week. Eleanor was asked if she would mind taking the smaller room at the back of the house, the one without a closet, with the window that faced the garage wall, so that the guest room would be free for the visitors. Eleanor did not mind. She moved her things. She made herself comfortable in the smaller room with the narrow window and the particular sound of the neighbor's car backing out at 6 every morning. Renata's parents left after 6 days. Eleanor's things did not move back. The guest room, she noticed, had new curtains and a small vase of dried flowers on the dresser. It looked prepared for the next occasion. Eleanor was not, apparently, the kind of guest for whom the front room needed to be maintained. She did not raise it. She arranged her things in the back room neatly and wrote the date in her notebook and let it go. Then came the kitchen. Eleanor had cooked her whole adult life and had run professional kitchens for 30 years. Cooking was not something she did with effort. It was something she was. When she offered to make Sunday dinners, and David's face lit up the way it had when he was 8, and she pulled a roast from the oven, she felt something she had not felt in the 2 years since Raymond died. Useful, present, necessary. For the first months, the kitchen was shared in the comfortable way of two people who are polite but not close, moving around each other without difficulty. Then, gradually, things began to move. The spice cabinet reorganized to a logic Eleanor did not recognize. Her baking supplies, the vanilla paste she had used for 20 years, the specialty flour she ordered from a mill in Vermont, the small flat tin of cardamom her mother had pressed into her hands as a wedding gift, migrated to the shelf she could not reach without the step stool. She moved them back. They moved again. She said nothing. Renata said nothing. The kitchen communicated in the way that rooms do when people will not say things directly. One Sunday, Renata stood in the kitchen doorway while Eleanor prepared the lamb roast she had served at Hargrove's kitchen for 30 years. She stood there the way someone stands in a space they own when observing a temporary arrangement. She poured water. She checked her phone. She glanced at the stove with an expression that was not quite a frown. Then she said, "I didn't realize you were doing lamb. My parents are coming next Sunday, and my mother doesn't eat lamb." "Your parents aren't coming this Sunday," Eleanor said carefully. "I know," Renata said. "I'm just saying, for next time, it would be helpful to check." Eleanor looked at her daughter-in-law's smooth, composed face. She said, "Of course." She tended the lamb. She let the moment pass. That night she wrote lamb in her notebook, under the date. The seating arrangement shifted around the same time. Not dramatically. Eleanor had always sat at the foot of the table, which she did not mind. But after Renata's parents visited, and then visited again, a new geography established itself and stayed. David at the head, Renata to his left, their guests on either side. And Eleanor, when the company was gone, and the table should have contracted back to something comfortable, at the narrow end near the kitchen door, where the table leg caught the floor unevenly, and the chair had the loose back, and the draft came from under the hallway door. She sat there. She said it was fine. It was not fine, but it was the kind of not fine that she had decided to absorb, to carry quietly, to observe. Her grandson Noah was 9 years old and sat beside her at the kitchen door end of the table without being asked. He had Eleanor's eyes, dark and attentive, the kind that process things before the rest of the face registers them. One Sunday, he looked at the draft coming from the hallway, and then at her and said, "Graham, how come you always sit here?" "I like it here," she told him. He looked at the draft again with the faint frown his father used when something didn't add up. Then he got up without a word, retrieved his sweater from the hook by the stairs, came back and laid it across her shoulders. Eleanor kept her face completely still. She wrote that down that night. Not the fact. The feeling. The plate began in March, not all at once. That is never how it works. It began, as most things do, with something small enough to explain away. A slightly thinner slice of roast, fewer potatoes. The vegetables distributed a little less generously than the ones on David's plate. Eleanor assumed, the first time, that it was Renata being practical in her particular way, the way that says older people eat less without actually asking. She let it go. Then, on a Sunday in March, about 11 months before everything changed, Eleanor came out of the kitchen with the roast on the serving platter and went back for the bread. While she was gone, she heard the sound of the cabinet, the familiar clink of a plate being lifted from a different shelf than the good stack. When she returned, there was a plate already waiting at her corner of the table. Her plate, set apart from the others, already filled, covered with a piece of foil. She lifted the foil. She recognized the food immediately. She recognized it because she had cooked it on Thursday, a quick weeknight chicken with roasted rice, the kind of simple, honest dinner she had made hundreds of times. Nothing wrong with it. But it was Thursday's food. The meat had the particular dullness that proteins develop when they have been reheated. The rice had contracted at the edges the way rice does when it sits too long. There was no fresh vegetable, no fresh bread, no Sunday roast. She looked at the plate. She looked at the roast she had just carried out, the one she had spent 9 hours preparing. She looked at Renata, who was ladling it onto the good dishes for everyone else, her back turned. Renata did not look at her. Eleanor sat down. She ate the food on the plate. She said nothing. But something changed in her that Sunday in March, in the way that something changes in deep water when the temperature shifts by a single degree, not visible on the surface, not obvious to anyone passing, but real and complete and irreversible. That night she opened her notebook. She wrote the date, March 14th. She wrote, "My plate." Below that she wrote, 11 months. She sat with that for a long time in the quiet of the back bedroom. Then she reached past the notebook and opened the bottom drawer of her bedside table, the one she rarely opened, and she took out a different folder, a thicker one, the one that had to do with a trust and a piece of land and a name that appeared on a document her son had never thought to read. She did not open the folder that night. She simply held it for a moment in both hands. Then she put it back. She turned off the light. She lay in the dark of the narrow room with the window that faced the garage wall, and she thought about Sunday dinners for a very long time. She waited for the right Sunday. 3 weeks later, Renata's parents came back to visit. They brought Renata's brother, Martin, and his wife, and their 2 daughters, who were 7 and 11, and had the particular high-energy confidence of children who have been told they are charming. The house was full. The table was extended. Renata set it with the good linen and the china she reserved for occasions. The wedding china, the good glasses, the folded cloth napkins that meant this dinner was being witnessed. Eleanor had been cooking since 8 in the morning. Bread first, The yeast needed time. Then bone broth for the gravy. Then the main roast, a shoulder that took hours. Then the glazed carrots. Then the potato gratin that Renata's father had once mentioned liking. She cooked with the same total concentration she had brought to the restaurant kitchen for 30 years. She did not resent the work. The work was hers. She moved through it with the quiet authority of someone who has done this 10,000 times and knows exactly where everything lives. At 5 o'clock, Renata came into the kitchen to plate the meal. This was the arrangement. Eleanor cooked. Renata plated. The division existed because Renata believed presentation was a statement, and because she did not quite trust Eleanor to make the right statement in front of her family. Eleanor was aware of this. She stood in the doorway and watched. Renata plated 7 beautiful dishes. The roast sliced and fanned on each plate with the precision of a woman who managed events professionally. The gratin in neat squares. The carrots bright and glazed. She worked efficiently, and the plates were genuinely lovely. Then she turned to the back of the counter. The plate was already there. It had been there since before Eleanor arrived that morning. A plate of leftover pasta from 4 days ago, reheated, with a small pile of bag salad that had been in the refrigerator since Tuesday, and a dinner roll that had gone soft from sitting in a plastic bag. Renata peeled back the foil, looked at it briefly, and carried it on the small tray she had begun using for Eleanor's plate. She walked past Eleanor in the doorway without meeting her eyes. Eleanor followed her into the dining room. She took her seat at the corner end, the kitchen door end, the loose-backed chair with the draft. She watched Renata distribute the beautiful plates to her family. She watched the guests murmur with pleasure. She heard Renata's father say, "Renata, this looks magnificent," and heard Renata say, "Thank you. It's a special occasion." David had not yet sat down. He was in the living room with Renata's father's brother, finishing a conversation. Renata set Eleanor's plate down in front of her corner seat without looking at her. "There you go," she said, the tone of a nurse leaving a tray. Then she turned back to her family. Eleanor looked at the plate. 4-day pasta, Tuesday salad, soft roll. She looked at David's empty chair. His plate would come from the kitchen in a moment. The beautiful full plate with the roast she had woken at dawn to prepare. She made her decision. She made it completely quietly. No speech, no announcement, no drama. She simply stood up. She picked up the plate in front of her. She carried it to David's empty chair. She set it down in David's place. Then she walked back to her corner, and she sat down, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she waited. 60 seconds later, David came in from the living room. He was smiling. He was relaxed. He was carrying a glass of wine and moving with the easy, unhurried comfort of a man in his own house, surrounded by family, on a Sunday evening. He sat down. He picked up his fork. He looked at his plate. The smile did not leave immediately. It took 4 seconds, 4 full seconds of looking at the plate in front of him, at the pasta, and the wilted salad, and the soft roll, while the table around him murmured with conversation, and his wife's family reached for their wine glasses, and the smell of Eleanor's roast filled every corner of the room. 4 seconds. And then David Hargrove's face changed. 4 seconds is not a long time. A held breath lasts longer. A heartbeat takes less. 4 seconds is the amount of time it takes for a traffic light to change, for a song to get through its opening bars, for a child to decide whether or not to cry. It was enough. David Hargrove sat at the head of his dining table on a Sunday evening in a house full of his wife's family, with the smell of the best roast he had eaten all year filling every room, and he looked at the plate in front of him for 4 seconds. The pasta was from Thursday. Eleanor knew this because she had made it. A simple weeknight dish. Chicken thighs in a tomato base over rigatoni. Honest food, good food. But it was 4 days old, and it had been reheated in a microwave, and it sat on the plate with the particular pallor of food that was not meant to be looked at twice. Beside it, A small heap of salad from a bag that had been in the refrigerator since Tuesday, the edges of the leaves gone translucent, the whole thing slightly defeated looking. And the roll. Soft from the bag it had sat in, the bottom of it slightly compressed from its own weight. David looked at it. Around him, Renata's family was doing what families do at the beginning of a good dinner, passing things, praising the table, asking for the wine. Renata's mother was complimenting the gratin. Renata's father was saying something about the roast being magnificent. Martin's daughters were bickering gently over which of them got the seat by the window. The sound of the table filled the room like warmth. David did not reach for his wine. He looked at the plate. Then he looked up. And he found Eleanor. She was sitting in her corner, at the kitchen door end of the table, with her hands folded in her lap. She was watching him with the patient, steady attention she had been watching him with his entire life. The look that meant, I see you, and I will wait. And in front of her was a beautiful full plate. The roast she had been cooking since 8 that morning. The glaze on the carrots catching the light. The gratin square and perfect. The fresh bread. His plate. David looked at her plate. He looked at his plate. He looked at Eleanor's face. She did not smile. She did not say anything. She was simply there, watching, with that perfect stillness she had carried his entire life. The stillness of someone who has been waiting for the right moment and has just confirmed it has arrived. For one long second, David Hargrove understood something he had been arranging not to understand for 11 months. Then Renata's voice came from his left, warm and social, directed at her mother. I'm so glad you could make it this visit. We've been wanting to do a real Sunday dinner for so long. David did not speak. He set his fork down very slowly. He looked at the plate again. He looked at Eleanor again. He looked around the table at the 7 people eating the food his mother had spent the entire day preparing, and then he looked at the plate of 4-day-old pasta that had been sitting under a piece of foil since before she arrived. David? Renata said. He turned to her. His face was difficult to read. This was unusual. David had always been a man whose emotions showed themselves quickly, whose happiness was warm and obvious, and whose discomfort was equally plain. The expression he was wearing now was something Eleanor had not seen on his face before. It was the expression of someone making a very difficult calculation. Everything all right? Renata asked. Her voice was still social, still turned toward her family, but her eyes had sharpened. Fine, David said. He picked up his fork. He did not eat. The dinner continued. It was a good dinner. The food saw to that. Eleanor had made certain of it. Renata's family ate with the enthusiasm of people who were genuinely enjoying themselves, and the conversation was easy, and the wine was poured twice more, and Renata moved through the role of hostess with the practiced efficiency she brought to everything she managed. Eleanor ate the roast she had cooked. It was very good. She had always known how to roast a shoulder. She said little. This was not unusual. At family gatherings, Eleanor tended to listen, a habit from 30 years of running dining rooms, where you learned quickly that the person who listened understood the room far better than the person who talked. She listened to Renata's mother describe a recent trip. She listened to Martin's wife talk about a renovation they were considering. She watched David. He ate the pasta. Not with appetite, with the mechanical, determined focus of a man eating because stopping would require explanation. He ate every bite. He accepted the bread basket when it came around and took a roll, and Eleanor noticed that he looked at the roll for just a moment before he put it on his side plate. A soft roll. From a bag. The same as the one on the plate she had swapped. He looked at her once during the meal, from the other end of the table. Just once. She was already looking at him. He held her gaze for 3 seconds, less time than it had taken him to understand the plate, but enough. And then he looked away. After dessert, while Renata and her mother were moving the serving dishes, and Martin's daughters were investigating the back garden, and the general pleasant dispersal of a family dinner was underway, David appeared in the kitchen doorway. Eleanor was at the sink. She had begun washing the roasting pan because she had cooked it, and it was her pan, and old habits do not require instruction. Mom. She did not turn around immediately. She finished rinsing the pan and set it in the drying rack. Then she turned. David stood in the doorway, with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders in the particular set that meant he was working something out and had not finished. He looked, she thought, very much like the boy who used to sit in her restaurant booth doing math problems he did not understand yet. That same expression of a mind trying to make an answer that should be there come into focus. The pasta was from Thursday, he said. She waited. The salad was from Tuesday, he said. She waited. He rubbed the back of his neck. It was a gesture she knew. He had done it since he was 9 years old, whenever he had something to say that he did not quite know how to say. How long? He asked. Eleanor dried her hands on the dish towel. She folded it over the oven handle the way she always did. 11 months, she said. The kitchen was quiet. See, from the dining room came the sound of voices, laughter, the clink of a glass being collected. David closed his eyes. I didn't know, he said. Eleanor looked at her son's face. She believed him. She had believed that for 11 months, that David had not known or had not let himself know, which was a different thing, but perhaps not entirely a different thing. She believed that the particular blindness of a man who loves a woman and has built a life with her and does not want to see something uncomfortable is real and not simply convenient. She believed all of that. And she believed also that I didn't know was not the same as it was not happening. I know you didn't, she said. Gently. Precisely. David opened his eyes. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him in a very long time. The look of a child confronted with something true about the world that he has not been prepared for. Mom, I'm sorry. I know that too, she said. She touched his arm once, briefly, and then Noah appeared in the kitchen doorway behind his father, 9 years old, and trailing a conversation from the garden, still talking about a cricket he had found, and the moment folded back into the texture of the evening. But Eleanor noted it. She noted it in the way she noted everything, completely, accurately, without embellishment or erasure. She wrote it down that night, just the word David had used. Sorry. And below that, not enough. Not yet. But real. So if this story has found you, if you've been holding your breath since the plate swap, and you understand what Eleanor is doing, what she is waiting for, what she already knows, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story from Margaret Reed. The best ones are still coming, and the people who watch to the end are exactly the ones who need to hear them. The week after the Sunday dinner was quiet in the way that weeks are quiet when something is moving underground. Renata said nothing about the plate swap. This was the detail Eleanor found most instructive. She had anticipated several possible responses: a direct confrontation, a cold withdrawal, a reframing of the evening that cast Eleanor as difficult or ungrateful. She had been prepared for any of those. What she had not expected was silence, and silence told her more than any of the alternatives would have. Renata knew, and Renata was deciding what to do about knowing. Eleanor watched her carefully during that week. She watched the way Renata moved through the kitchen with a fraction more deliberateness than usual, checking things that did not need checking, reorganizing shelves that had already been organized. She watched the way Renata spoke to David in the evenings, in the low, careful tones of someone shaping a conversation rather than having one. She watched the way Renata's eyes moved to Eleanor when she entered a room. A quick, assessing glance, the kind that wanted to know what you knew. Eleanor gave her nothing to read. She cooked. She gardened in the mornings. She sat in the corner chair and ate her meals. Renata had not repeated the separate plate. Not that week, perhaps because the calculation had shifted. And she said thank you and of course, and that sounds lovely in all the right places. She was pleasant. She was contained. She was, to anyone watching without her particular depth of attention, exactly what she appeared to be. On Thursday of that week, she made a phone call. She made it from her car, parked 2 blocks from the house, on a Wednesday afternoon while Renata was at work, and David was at his office, and Noah was at school. She sat with the engine off and the windows up, and she called a number she had not dialed in 4 years. "Whitmore and Associates, how can I help you?" "This is Eleanor Hargrove," she said. "I'd like to speak with Gerald Whitmore, please." "Tell him it's about the living trust." Gerald Whitmore had been Raymond's lawyer before he became Eleanor's. He was a compact, careful man in his mid-70s who wore bow ties and kept a jar of peppermints on his desk, and had the particular quality, rare in any profession, of saying exactly what he meant. Eleanor had always found this restful. She did not have a high tolerance for people who communicated around the edges of things. He had managed the Eleanor Hargrove Living Trust since its establishment 14 years earlier, and he managed it still, with the unhurried meticulousness of a man who understood that the value of a document was not in how quickly you produced it, but in how precisely it held. They met in his office on Friday afternoon. So the jar of peppermints was on the desk exactly where it had always been. Gerald shook her hand and said, "Eleanor," in the warm, unflappable way he had always said it, as though her name were a complete and satisfying sentence, and she sat down in the good chair across from his desk and told him she wanted a full accounting. "Everything in the trust," she said. "I want to understand the complete picture, all of it." Gerald nodded. He did not ask why. This was one of the things she had always appreciated about him. He excused himself to retrieve the current documents from the secure filing room and returned 12 minutes later with a folder that was considerably thicker than the one Eleanor kept in her bedside drawer. He set it on the desk and opened it with the efficient care of a man who has spent 50 years handling things other people find overwhelming. He began with the real property. The lot, the parcel of land in the quiet suburb, the one with the tree-lined streets and the neighborhood association, and the house her son believed was entirely his, was assessed at its current market value of $412,000. This value had increased substantially since the lot was purchased 3 decades ago, when the neighborhood was still modest and the streets were not yet lined with anything. The lot was held in full by the Eleanor Hargrove Living Trust. It was, Gerald confirmed, unencumbered by the mortgage David had taken on the house above it, because the mortgage was on the structure, not the land. Xiao and the land had never been transferred to David's name. Eleanor had known this, but hearing Gerald say it plainly, with the documents open on the desk between them, gave the fact a different weight than it had carried in her bedside drawer. "The house cannot be sold or refinanced without the trust's cooperation," Gerald said, "because you cannot convey clear title on the structure without resolving the underlying land ownership." He paused and added, in his precise way, "David's bank may not have fully understood this when the mortgage was arranged. It is not uncommon." "No," Eleanor said. "I don't imagine they looked too closely." Gerald continued with the investment accounts. The proceeds from the restaurant sale, $3.4 million, invested through a management firm over the 12 years since the sale, had grown with the particular steady patience of money that is not touched and not frightened. The current value of those investments was $4.9 million. Eleanor listened to this number with the same quiet attention she brought to everything. She had known, approximately, what was there. She had not known the exact figure. She noted it the way she noted everything, completely, without drama. There was also a smaller account she had established separately, 20 years ago, from a piece of property she and Raymond had sold early in the restaurant years. This had been compounding without her attention for 2 decades and had arrived at a figure that surprised even her. Gerald finished the accounting and folded his hands on the desk. He looked at her across the peppermint jar. "You have been very well provided for," he said. "Raymond was a planner," she said. "You were a planner," Gerald corrected, gently but firmly. "He helped. But the decisions were yours." Eleanor accepted this. "Is there something specific prompting this review?" Gerald asked. Eleanor considered the question. She thought about the corner chair and the kitchen drafts, and the bedside drawer, and 11 Sundays of leftover food. She thought about Noah's sweater across her shoulders, and David's face above the plate of 4-day-old pasta. "I want to understand what I have," she said, "before I decide what to do with it." Gerald nodded. This was sufficient for him. "Do you have a timeline?" he asked. "Not yet," she said. "But I'll know when I know." Gerald allowed himself a small smile. "You always have," he said. So she took a peppermint on the way out. She had not done that in years. It tasted exactly as she remembered. In the week that followed, David came to her room. Not with Renata. Alone. On a Tuesday evening, he knocked on the door of the back bedroom, the narrow room with the garage wall window, and stood in the doorway with 2 cups of tea, the way he had stood in doorways his entire life, waiting to be invited in. "Can I sit down?" he asked. "Of course," she said. He sat on the edge of the chair in the corner of the room, a small armchair she had brought from her apartment, one of the few pieces of her own furniture she had kept, and he held his tea in both hands, the way he had held things since childhood. For a while they sat quietly. The evening was cool, and the garage wall window was dark, and the house around them was making its evening sounds. Eleanor waited. She had always been very good at waiting. "I've been thinking," David said finally. "I know," she said. He gave her a small, tired smile. "You always know." He turned the teacup slowly. "I've been trying to understand when things changed. Between me and you, I mean. When I stopped. When I stopped being the way I used to be." Eleanor looked at her son. She thought about the boy who had told strangers her food was the best in Ohio. She thought about the man who had sat at the head of the table and accepted, Sundays for 11 months, a separate plate arrangement in his own house without asking about it. "I think things change slowly," she said. "Small enough that you can always find a reason not to call it what it is." David was quiet for a moment. "She's not," he began, and then stopped. He tried again. "It isn't that she's a bad person. I haven't said she is." "No." He looked at the tea. "You haven't said much of anything." "No," Eleanor agreed. David looked up. "That's what worries me." She held his eyes. He had always been perceptive, her son, quick to understand things when he let himself understand them. It was the letting himself that took the work. "What worries you about it?" she asked. "That you've been watching," he said, "and deciding." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Eleanor said, "Have some tea before it goes cold." He drank his tea. They sat together for another half hour in the back bedroom with the garage wall window, and Eleanor told him things she had not told him in years. Stories about the first location, songs about the Saturday when the walk-in freezer broke 2 hours before a full booking, and she and Raymond packed every ingredient into ice chests and cooked the whole service anyway. Stories about his father. Ordinary, sustaining stories. David listened the way he had listened as a boy, like every word was worth something. When he left, he paused in the doorway. "Mom," he said. "Yes." "I miss how things used to be." Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. "Things can change back," she said. "Or they can change into something new, but they don't stay where they are. Things never stay where they are." He thought about that for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and went. Noah found her in the garden on a Saturday morning. He was still in his pajamas, sewed the ones with the small rockets on them that he had owned for 2 years and was almost too tall for now, and he came out into the early morning with his bare feet in the damp grass and found Eleanor crouching over the last of the autumn herbs with her canvas gloves on. "Graham." "Good morning, Noah." He crouched beside her in the way children crouch, completely, without stiffness, with total commitment to being at ground level. He looked at what she was doing and then looked at her face. "Are you leaving?" he asked. The question arrived with the particular directness that 9-year-olds deploy when they have been carrying something and can no longer carry it quietly. Eleanor did not look up immediately. She finished what she was doing with the sage, and then sat back on her heels and looked at her grandson. His face was serious. He had been worrying about this, she could see, probably for longer than this morning. "Why do you ask?" she said. "Because you seem different," he said, "since the Sunday when you moved the plates." She looked at him. "You saw that." "I always see things," he said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child who has always known this about himself. "Mom doesn't think I do. But I do." Eleanor pulled off one of her canvas gloves and held it in her hand. "What do you think you saw?" she asked. Noah considered. He looked at the sage. He looked at the grass. "I think you decided something," he said. "And I think when you decide things, things happen." She studied his face for a long moment. He looked back at her without flinching. He had always been able to hold her eyes, this child. Most people, she had noticed. She found it easier to look slightly away from direct attention. Noah had never learned to look away. "Are you worried?" she asked. "A little," he said honestly, "but mostly I think it'll be okay." He paused. "Will it?" Eleanor looked at her grandson, 9 years old, bare feet in wet grass, wearing rocket pajamas, asking the most direct question anyone in the house had asked her in 2 years. She thought about the trust folder in Gerald Whitmore's office. She thought about a lot assessed at $412,000. She thought about a kitchen she had built with her own hands and a brand she had carried for 30 years and $3.4 million that had been quietly growing for 12 years, while her daughter-in-law moved her baking supplies to the top shelf. "Yes," she told her grandson. "It will be okay." "Okay," Noah said. He appeared satisfied with this. He pulled a piece of grass from the lawn, examined it, set it back down. "Graham? How come you didn't say anything? For all those months, the plate and the room and everything?" Eleanor turned the canvas glove over in her hands. She thought about how to say it in a way a 9-year-old could carry. Sometimes, she said, you need to let people show you exactly who they are, before you do anything, so that when the time comes and you act, you know exactly what you're acting on, not your imagination, not what you hope. The truth. Noah absorbed this. "And you know the truth now?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I know it completely." Noah nodded slowly, the way he nodded when something made sense to him. "Okay," he said again. Then he leaned over and put his head briefly on her shoulder, just for a moment, a gesture as natural and unannounced as breathing, and then he stood up and went back into the house for breakfast. Eleanor sat in the garden for a while after he left. She wrote it down that afternoon, not what he said, just, "Noah knows. Noah is fine." And then, soon, 2 weeks after Eleanor's visit to Gerald Whitmore's office, a man came to the house. It was a Thursday afternoon. Eleanor was in the kitchen making bread. The good bread, from her grandmother's recipe, the kind that took the whole morning. She heard the doorbell and heard Renata's heels on the hardwood and heard the front door open, and then she heard a voice she did not recognize say, in the particular tone that people use when they are addressing someone whose time they value, "Good afternoon. I'm looking for Ms. Eleanor Hargrove." Eleanor's hands were in the dough. She did not move. There was a brief pause. She could not see Renata's face, but she could hear the pause and understand it precisely. Yes. She lives here. Can I ask what this is regarding?" "I'm from Whitmore and Associates," the man said. "It's regarding a property matter. Ms. Hargrove is expecting me." Another pause. Shorter this time. "I'll get her," Renata said. The heels came toward the kitchen. Renata appeared in the doorway. Her face was composed and pleasant and entirely unreadable. She was very good at that. "There's someone at the door for you," she said. "A man from a law office." "Thank you," Eleanor said. She rinsed her hands at the sink and dried them on the dish towel and folded it over the oven handle the way she always did. She walked to the front door. The man was young, 30 or so, in a good coat and carrying a document case. He handed her a sealed envelope. Ms. Hargrove. Mr. Whitmore asked me to deliver this personally. Thank you, Eleanor said. He said to let him know if you have any questions. I'll be in touch, she said. The man nodded and went back down the front path. Eleanor closed the door. She turned around. Renata was standing in the hall behind her. She had not gone back to what she was doing. She was simply standing there, her arms loosely folded, looking at the envelope in Eleanor's hands. Is everything all right? She asked. Fine, Eleanor said pleasantly. Just some paperwork I asked him to prepare. Renata's eyes moved from the envelope to Eleanor's face, looking for something to read. Eleanor gave her nothing. What kind of paperwork? Renata asked. Nothing urgent, Eleanor said. She tucked the envelope under her arm. I should get back to the bread. It doesn't like waiting. She went back to the kitchen. Behind her, she heard Renata standing in the hallway for a moment longer than was natural. Then the heels, measured and deliberate, in the direction of the living room. That evening, Eleanor heard Renata and David talking in the bedroom. Not words. The sound was too low and too far, but the rhythm of it. The particular rhythm of a conversation that has a shape, a purpose, a point being pressed toward. She did not listen harder. She did not need to. She knew that rhythm. She had heard it through walls her whole life. In the restaurant, in her own kitchen, in the back booth where David had done his homework, and occasionally overheard things he should not have overheard. The rhythm of someone in a conversation who is pushing, and someone who is being pushed, and someone deciding how much to push back. She opened her notebook. She wrote, "The envelope." Renata saw it. She is calculating now. Then she wrote 2 more lines. David is nearly ready. He just doesn't know it yet. 1 more Sunday. She closed the notebook. She turned off the lamp. The house was quiet around her. The narrow room with the garage wall window, the cool October dark settling into the walls. A good house. A house built on good land. Her land. She lay in the dark and thought about next Sunday. She thought about what she was going to do, and in what order, and what it would cost, and what it would give back. She thought about the restaurant kitchen and Raymond's hands, and the bread recipe her grandmother had pressed into her palm when she was 11 years old. She thought about Noah's bare feet in the wet grass. It will be okay, she had told him. She meant it completely. There is something Eleanor Hargrove understood about Sunday mornings that she had never tried to explain to anyone, because it was the kind of understanding that exists below words, in the body rather than the mind. Sunday mornings belonged to bread, not to schedules, not to conversations waiting to be had, not to the particular heaviness of what was coming in the afternoon. They belonged to the weight of dough in her hands, and the smell that built slowly from the oven, and the specific quality of early morning light in a kitchen before anyone else was awake. She had baked bread every Sunday of her adult life. Through the restaurant years, and the grief years, and the selling years, and the moving in years. Through 11 months of corner chairs and leftover plates. The bread had never changed. The bread had never been taken from her. She made it that morning, knowing it would be the last Sunday she made it in this kitchen. She was not sad about this. She was simply clear about it, the way you are clear about things when you have spent a long time deciding and have finally decided completely. The dough needed an hour. She used the hour the way she always used it, quietly, attending to things, saw making the kitchen right before the day asked anything of her. She watered the herbs on the windowsill. She wiped down the counter. She took her canvas bag from the hook by the back door and placed it on the table with the things already inside it. Her grandmother's bread recipe, folded to a square and soft from years of handling. Her leather notebook. The photographs from her bedside drawer. Raymond at the first restaurant. Their wedding. David at 8 years old in the back booth. Noah the week he was born. Held in Eleanor's arms, looking at the world with the expression of someone who has just arrived and is already paying attention. She placed the canvas bag on the table and went back to tend the bread. At 9 o'clock, Noah came downstairs, saw he had grown half an inch since September. She could see it in the way his pajama hems had climbed toward his ankles. He stood in the kitchen doorway in his rocket pajamas and his bare feet and looked at the bag on the table and then looked at her and said nothing for a moment. "Is today the day?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He looked at the bag again. He looked at the bread in the oven. He looked back at her. "Okay," he said. He sat at the kitchen table and she made him toast and they ate together in the early morning quiet. And Eleanor thought that this ordinary thing, her grandson in his pajamas at her table, the butter softening and the light coming through the window, this was what she was building toward. Not away from, toward. So she had told Gerald Whitmore 3 weeks earlier what she wanted to do, and Gerald had, in his precise, unhurried way, made certain it could be done. He had also, at Eleanor's request, arranged to come to the house that Sunday afternoon. Not as a surprise. Eleanor had told David there would be a meeting, and she had told him it concerned the trust, and she had told him to be there. She had said it in the same calm, matter-of-fact tone she used for everything, the tone that conveyed no urgency, no drama, no preview of what was coming. "Just some paperwork I need to go through with you," she said. "Gerald will be here at 2, David had told Renata. Renata had spent the days between that conversation and this Sunday arranging her own understanding of the situation, so Eleanor had watched her do it, had watched her research, had watched her speak to David in those low, careful tones, had watched her compose herself into the posture of a person who manages events for a living and who intended, on Sunday afternoon, to manage this one. She did not know what she was managing. This was the essential thing. She was preparing for a version of the situation that had not yet revealed itself to her, and so all her preparation was for the wrong thing. Eleanor understood this. She had not corrected it. Gerald Whitmore arrived at 2 o'clock precisely, which was his way. He wore his bow tie and carried his document case and stood on the front porch with the dignified composure of a man who has handled important matters for 50 years and learned that the way you carry yourself into a room tells people more than anything you say in it. Renata opened the door. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, pleasant and controlled, and extending her hand in the manner of a professional greeting a professional. "Mrs. Hargrove," Gerald said. He shook her hand with the courteous brevity of someone whose interest lies elsewhere. His eyes moved past her. "Is Miss Hargrove available?" "Not Eleanor, not David's mother. Ms. Hargrove." Renata's hand came back to her side. She turned. "Eleanor, Mr. Whitmore is here." Eleanor came from the kitchen. She had been washing her hands from the bread, which had come out exactly right. See, she was wearing her good blouse, the dark blue one, because today was an occasion, even if she was the only one in the room who knew it yet. She came into the hallway, and Gerald looked at her with his particular warmth and said, "Eleanor, you look well." "I feel well," she said. "Thank you for coming." They went through to the dining room. David was already there. He had set the table with water glasses, the practical instinct of a man who expects a meeting and does not quite know what kind. He stood up when they came in and shook Gerald's hand and said, "Thank you for making time for this." "Of course," Gerald said. He set his document case on the table and looked around the room once. Just once, the brief accounting glance of a man who reads spaces well, and took the chair Eleanor indicated. Renata sat across from him. She had her hands folded on the table in the manner she used in professional settings. She had her face in the manner she used when she intended to be in control of something. Eleanor sat beside Gerald. David sat across from them both, at the end that was usually his end, and looked at his mother with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite managing it. "Well," Gerald said pleasantly, opening the document case. "Shall we begin?" He was not a dramatic man. He did not build to things. He simply laid them out, in order, clearly, the way he had always done everything, as though information were a landscape to be mapped accurately, with no territory omitted and no feature exaggerated. He began with the purpose of the trust. He explained that Eleanor had established the Eleanor Hargrove Living Trust 14 years earlier, following the model of a similar trust her late husband had recommended, with the intention of protecting and managing the assets accumulated during her years in business. He explained that Eleanor had served as trustee throughout. He explained that the trust's assets were varied and that he would go through them one at a time. Then he began. Renata's expression changed during the real property section. It was a small change, a fractional tightening around the eyes, a slight stilling of the hands that had been folded with such deliberate calm. Eleanor watched it with the same attention she brought to everything. The property at, and Gerald read out the address. The address of this house. The address of the quiet suburb with the tree-lined streets and the neighborhood association is assessed at its current market value of $412,000. The parcel is held in full by the Eleanor Hargrove Living Trust and has never been transferred to any individual title. The residential structure above the parcel is subject to a mortgage, which is Mr. David Hargrove's financial obligation. However, the land itself remains the asset of the trust. A silence. Then David said, in a voice that was very carefully level, "Say that again." Gerald said it again. Renata looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked back at her pleasantly. "The house is on my land," Eleanor said. "It has always been on my land. Your father recommended I buy it before this neighborhood was worth very much. That was 30 years ago." David's mouth opened slightly. Closed. He looked at the table, then at the window, then at his mother. The arithmetic was happening behind his eyes. Eleanor could see it, the same way she had seen it his whole life, the particular internal motion of a mind reorganizing around new information. He had always been a quick thinker when he let himself think. But the mortgage, he started. "Is yours," Gerald confirmed. "The mortgage is on the structure, but you cannot convey clear title on a residential structure without the underlying land. Any sale of the property, any refinancing beyond the current terms, would require the cooperation of the trust, which is to say, the cooperation of your mother." The room was very quiet. Gerald continued. The investment accounts were next. First, he outlined them with the same measured clarity. The restaurant sale proceeds, their growth over 12 years, the separate account from the earlier property. He did not editorialize. He did not pause for effect. He simply read the numbers in the tone of someone reading the weather. Eleanor heard Renata draw a breath at one of the numbers. A small breath, barely audible. The kind you draw when a figure is larger than you prepared yourself for. When Gerald finished, he closed the folder and folded his hands on the table and looked at Eleanor. "Is there anything you'd like me to clarify?" he asked. "No," she said. "I think it's very clear." She turned to David. David was looking at her. His face had completed its reorganization and arrived somewhere she had not seen before, a place past shock and past arithmetic, and into something older and quieter. His eyes were wet, though he was not going to cry, because he was his father's son, and his father had always held himself very still in difficult moments. "Mom," he said. She waited. "How long have you— the restaurants, the sale? I knew you had some savings, but You never asked," she said, not as a reproach, as a fact. "You never told me." "No," she agreed. "I didn't want you to feel like you hadn't built your own life. You have. But the foundation was always mine to hold." She paused. "I built it the same way I built everything, slowly, without making a fuss about it." David looked down at his hands. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked up again. "The corner chair?" he said softly. "Yes." His jaw tightened. "The plate?" "Yes. I let that happen." He said it flatly, without looking for absolution in it. This was, Eleanor thought, perhaps the most clearly she had ever heard him speak. "I sat at the head of the table for 11 months, and I let that happen." She did not say yes to that one. She let it rest between them. Renata had been silent for several minutes. This was itself extraordinary. She was never silent for several minutes. Eleanor had been watching her from the corner of her eye, and she had watched Renata's composure do what composure does when the situation it was designed to manage has turned out to be much larger than expected. Hold, bend, hold, and then begin, very slightly, to show its limits. When Renata finally spoke, her voice was careful in the way of someone who is making a decision with every word. "I want to understand," she said, "what this means going forward. Practically." She was looking at Gerald. Gerald looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Renata. "It means," Eleanor said, "exactly what Gerald said. The land is mine. Your home is on my land. Nothing about your daily life needs to change." She held Renata's eyes. "I am not here to take anything from you." "Then what are you here to do?" Renata asked. The question hung in the air. It was the most direct thing Renata had said to her in 2 years. Eleanor found she preferred it to the smooth, managed courtesy enormously. "I'm here to tell you the truth," Eleanor said. "The truth that has always been true. And then I'm going to go to my new house." The room went very still. "Your new house," David said. "I signed the lease 3 weeks ago. It's a small place, garden flat, with a proper kitchen and a real garden. My things are being collected this afternoon." She looked at her son steadily. "I should have done this sooner. I stayed because I thought being nearby mattered more than being comfortable. I understand now that I was wrong." "Mom," David began. "I am not angry," she said. This was the truth, and she meant it completely. "I made a choice to stay, and I made a choice to watch, and I made a choice about when to act. Those were my choices. I own them." She paused. "But I am also choosing to leave. And that choice is mine too." David stood up from his chair. He looked like he was going to say several things and could not find the order for them. He looked at Gerald, then at the folder, then at Eleanor, saw then at the canvas bag she had brought in from the kitchen and set on the sideboard by the door. "You already have your things packed," he said. "The important things," she said. "The rest can be collected properly." He crossed the room in 4 steps and stood in front of her and looked at her the way he had looked at her his whole life, like she was the most reliable thing in any room she entered, and said, "Please don't go." Eleanor looked at her son. She thought about the boy who had carried her hand at his father's funeral and tried to be brave. She thought about the man who had sat at the head of the table and found the pasta on his plate and understood what it meant. She thought about the tea in the back bedroom and the way he had said, "I miss how things used to be." She reached up and put her hand on his face. He was 43 years old, and she could still feel, in the shape of his jaw against her palm, the shape of the child he had been. "Come to dinner," she said. "Sunday evenings. Bring Noah. The door will always be open." He closed his eyes. "Bring Renata too," she said, "when she's ready." She felt rather than saw Renata, still at the table, very still in a way that was different from her usual stillness. The composed, managing stillness had gone somewhere. What remained was something quieter, something Eleanor had not seen in Renata's face before in 2 years of living in the same house. She recognized it because she had seen it in other faces over 30 years of restaurant rooms. It was the particular expression of someone who has just understood, very completely, what they have been doing. Not been told, not accused. She's understood, from the inside, which is the only way understanding lasts. She found Noah in the hallway. He was sitting on the bottom stair with the loaf of bread from that morning, wrapped in the good dish towel, held on his lap in both arms the way he held things he considered important. "I thought you should have it," he said, "for your new place." Eleanor looked at her grandson, 9 years old, still in the rocket pajamas, because nobody had made him change, holding a loaf of bread like it was something precious that needed protecting. Something in her chest shifted in the particular way that only certain moments can move it. She sat down beside him on the bottom stair. She put her arm around his shoulders. He leaned into her in the natural, unthinking way of a child who has always leaned. Will you come and see me? She said. Every week, he said immediately. You already said I could. I'll hold you to that. I know. He was quiet for a moment. Can we plant things in the new garden? Whatever you like. Can you teach me to make the bread? It takes a whole morning. I know. I want to learn the whole morning. Eleanor pressed her lips together very firmly for a moment. She was not going to cry on the bottom stair in her son's house. She had made that decision some weeks ago, and she intended to honor it. All right, she said. The whole morning. Noah nodded, satisfied. He straightened slightly, which was as close as he came to standing at attention. Graham? I think things are going to be different now. She looked at him. Different how? He considered. Better, he said, but different better. Not the same as before. New better. Eleanor thought about that. I think you're right, she said. I usually am, he told her, entirely without arrogance, simply as a statement of his experience so far. She laughed. A real laugh, the kind that comes from the diaphragm, unplanned. She had not laughed like that in this house in a very long time. She stood up and held out her hand, and he put the loaf of bread into it with the careful gravity of a formal transfer. Take care of your father, she said. He's going to need reminding, occasionally, what things are worth. I know, Noah said. I already do that. She kissed the top of his head. He allowed it. Then she picked up her canvas bag from the sideboard, tucked the bread under her arm, and walked out of the house into the clear October afternoon. The weeks that followed were neither simple nor dramatic. David called her the next morning. He called her the morning after that. He called with the consistency of a man who has understood that he allowed a distance to develop and intends to repair it through the reliable accumulation of presence. The calls were sometimes awkward. There were silences, recalibrations, the particular unevenness of a relationship finding its new footing. But they were real. Eleanor valued real over smooth. He came to Sunday dinner the following weekend. He came alone, which she did not comment on. She made the roast she had been making his whole life, and they sat at her table, a round table, no corners, no hierarchy of seating, and they talked for 3 hours. About the restaurant years, about Raymond, just about David's first day of school and his first serious mistake at work, and the Saturday morning they had driven 4 hours to see a baseball game, and it rained the entire time, and they had laughed until Eleanor had to pull over. He cried somewhere in the second hour. Not loudly. He had always cried quietly, the way his father did, with the stoic determination of a man who considers feeling something deeply a private matter. He cried, and she did not make a ceremony of it. She simply put the bread basket slightly closer to him, because bread has always been the thing she offers when words are insufficient. He came the following Sunday, and the one after that. Noah came Saturdays. He arrived with his overnight bag and his homework, and, after the 3rd week, a pair of gardening gloves she had not bought him, which he had apparently purchased himself at the hardware store with his own money. He planted bulbs in the November ground with the patient focus of a 9-year-old who has decided that something matters. He learned the bread, the whole morning of it, the yeast and the waiting and the understanding that you cannot rush the parts that require time. He learned to tell by the feel of the dough when it was right, which is a thing that cannot be taught exactly, but can be learned if you pay attention, and Noah paid attention to everything. Renata came to Sunday dinner for the first time in early December. She arrived with David, and she sat at Eleanor's round table, and she was quieter than Eleanor had ever seen her. Not the managed, strategic quiet, a different kind, the kind that comes after. She helped clear the plates without being asked. Eleanor did not comment on this. She simply said thank you. In the same tone, she said thank you for everything, and handed her the dish towel. They did not speak about the meeting with Gerald, or the trust, or the corner chair, or the 11 months of plates. They spoke about the bread. Renata asked how Eleanor had learned to make it, and Eleanor told her about her grandmother, and the piece of paper pressed into her palm when she was 11 years old, and the instruction, "Don't lose it." Renata listened with an attention Eleanor had not seen from her before. Not polite attention, real attention, the kind that means you are letting something land. When they left that evening, Renata paused in the doorway. She did not make a speech. She was not a woman given to speeches, and Eleanor did not want one. She simply looked at Eleanor for a moment and said, "Thank you for dinner." "Come back," Eleanor said. It was not a command, it was an invitation. Renata looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she nodded, and she and David walked down the path toward the car, and Eleanor stood in the doorway watching them go. She did not know yet what Renata would become to her. She was not sure it mattered to decide in advance. She had spent 2 years deciding things about Renata from a corner chair, and she had been right about what she saw. But she understood now that rightness about the past did not mean certainty about the future. The future was its own thing. It had to be grown, like bread, like gardens, like the particular trust that develops between people who have stopped performing for each other and started being honest. Don't she would wait and see. She was very good at waiting. In February, Eleanor did something she had been thinking about since the November morning she signed her new lease. She opened a kitchen. Not a restaurant. She was 71 years old, and she was not going to stand a double shift service again, not even for food she loved. Something smaller. A teaching kitchen, 3 mornings a week, in a space she leased in the neighborhood near her new flat. 6 tables, a good stove, and the smell that she had built into every kitchen she had ever worked. The particular smell that makes people stop in the doorway and breathe and feel, without being able to explain it, that someone here is glad they came. She called it Raymond's. She taught people to cook the way she had always cooked, from memory, from instinct, from the kind of paying attention that lives in the hands. Real food, bread and broth and roasts, and the kind of Sunday dinners that exist outside of any particular Sunday, that belong to the longer time of people feeding people. Her students were all ages, all kinds. Young people who had never learned, older people whose kitchens had gone quiet, people who came because they were lonely and left because they were fed, which is sometimes the same thing solved by the same means. Noah came on Saturdays still, and often stayed to help with the Sunday morning prep. He had started teaching the bread to Renata's niece, with the particular patient authority of a 10-year-old who has decided he is an expert and intends to share. David came to Sunday dinner almost every week. Occasionally, he came on other days, a Tuesday, not a Thursday evening, as though he was finding his way back to the habit of simply coming, without an occasion to justify it, the way he had come for dinner his whole childhood, without needing a reason beyond "this is where I belong." The house on his lot, on Eleanor's land, stood as it always had. Nothing about the legal arrangement had changed. The mortgage was his, the land was hers, and they had spoken with Gerald about what would happen eventually, and the arrangement was clear and fair, and not a weapon in either direction. It was simply the truth, a foundation, the way Thomas had always said foundations should be, present, reliable, beneath everything, noticed only when you stop and think about what you are standing on. Eleanor tended her garden in the mornings. She kept her leather notebook in the drawer by her bed, and she wrote things down in it, recipes still and other things, and dates. The dates were different now, not records of things taken from her, records of things built. A Sunday in March, Noah planted the first sweet peas. He is already planning for summer. A Tuesday in April, David came for no reason. We talked for 2 hours. He stayed for dinner. A Sunday in May, Renata asked me to teach her the bread. She listened with her whole self. I think she is beginning to understand what it means. And one morning in June, very early, with the garden full of the first real warmth of summer, and the bread in the oven, and Noah still asleep in the spare room where he stayed on Friday nights. This is the right table, the right kitchen, the right chair. Everything else was preparation. There is a lesson in Eleanor Hargrove's story that she never stated directly. She was not a woman who stated things directly when she could demonstrate them instead. But if you watched her, if you watched the whole long, careful arc of it, from the corner chair to the plate to the quiet meeting with Gerald in his bow tie, to the round table with no head and no corner. You would understand it. The woman you seat in the corner is not diminished by the corner. She is watching. The woman you hand the leftover plate is not humbled by the plate. She is deciding. The woman you believe to be dependent, modest, grateful for the room and the roof and the small portion, that woman may be holding the deed to the land your house stands on. She may have spent 30 years building something you never thought to ask about. She may have a lawyer who calls her Ms. Hargrove in the tone reserved for people who hold real things. And she will not tell you any of this until she is certain you have shown her exactly who you are. Because the women who built things in silence, who worked before anyone gave them credit and managed after anyone stopped watching, who kept the accounts and the kitchens and the families running and never required a stage to do it, those women do not need to announce their power. They simply use it when the time comes, with economy and precision, and the particular satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for exactly this moment and knew from the beginning exactly how it would go. The plate was never about the plate. The plate was the last piece of a question Eleanor had been asking for 2 years. Who are you, really? When you think no one important is watching, who are you? She had her answer, and she knew exactly what to do with it. Thank you for staying all the way to the end. The people who finish the whole story are the ones who understand it, and the ones who share it. If this one moved you, the next video on your screen is waiting to do the same. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come back. There's always another woman the world underestimated, and we tell those stories here.